The CS time clock is not just a clocking recording device. What distinguishes it from other time clocks is that it also has the ability to process employee hours. By default, the clock is shipped with all the processing features enabled, but we're going to start as if this is not the case. So to configure the processing rules, you need to be able to access the clock's web interface. So I'm going to just quickly log into my clock here. And processing is enabled or disabled under the Processing Global Settings menu. As you can see at the moment, Auto Process is disabled. When auto processing is disabled, it simply calculates the total time between the first in and the last out clocking for the day. If there is no out clocking for the day, it will calculate until the next out clocking, even if that clocking falls on the next day or is a few days later. In other words, it can easily handle night and double shifts. Let's have a look at an example. So if we go to Employees, and let's have a look at Bruce's hours, you can see you just have the 1 hours column with the total hours. And as an example of a double shift, I just want to change our date. Now Bruce clocked in on the 24th at 8:07 and he only clocked out the next day on the 25th at 5:30. And you can see it gives you the total hours worked as 33 hours 23 minutes. Now these total hours are calculated dynamically. In other words, the hours are not saved in the database, but is calculated when you open the daily hours or the payroll hours window. With processing disabled, no public holiday or leave hours will be assigned. If the auto reset clocking direction is enabled, the employee status will be reset to out and outside at midnight. But we're going to go into more depth on the auto reset direction function at a later stage. Let's go back to Global Settings, and I'm going to enable auto processing. Now once processing is enabled, a daily hours record will be created at the beginning of each day, and it is updated automatically when the employee clocks or when a leave record is added. You can force reprocessing when changing employee hours, and you can also override the values in the processed records. Now I'm going to leave all the options in this global settings as it is at the moment, and I'll go through each of these settings during this webinar. When we now look at the employee hours with auto process enabled, you will now see 11 hours columns instead of just 1. Now, each of these columns has a fixed meaning, which can be manipulated to a certain degree. To make use of those columns, you first need to set up a shift schedule for each of your employees. You can create your shift schedules under Processing, Employee Schedules. And I've already created 5 employee schedules to use as examples of how the processing is done. Let's have a look at the rules around your employee schedule. If no schedule is present for an employee, all the hours are allocated to the normal column. So anything between the first in and the last out clocking will be displayed under normal. Please note that your schedules are limited to a 7-day cycle. In your schedule setup, you need to enter a start and an end time for every day that the employee is expected to work. Any time before the start time will be allocated to your extra column. Time between the expected start and end times is allocated to the normal column between Monday and Fridays, and over a weekend it will be allocated to your Sunday or Saturday columns respectively. Anything after your expected end time goes to the overtime column. If both your start and your end times are left at 0, any time worked on that day will be allocated to your overtime column. If you set your start time to 0 and your end time to 23:59, all the time worked on that day will be allocated to your normal, your Saturday or Sunday time, depending on which day of the week it is. Let's have a look at some examples of the hours for employees who's got employee schedules assigned to them. Now this employee does not have an employee schedule assigned, and if we just have a look at 1 week to make it easier to see, you will see that all his hours worked goes into the normal column. An employee with a schedule, this employee is expected to work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Any time worked before the scheduled start time goes into extra. Time worked between the scheduled start and end times go to normal, and anything after your scheduled end time goes into the overtime column. On a day without a schedule or without expected hours, on which your start and your end times are both 0, any time worked will be allocated to your overtime column. This employee schedule has the Saturday and the Sunday time set up with a start time of 0 and an end time of 23:59. And as you can see, all the hours are allocated to the Saturday column. If any deductions have to be made from the employee's total time worked, you can enter the total under the lunch column. So if we just go back to our employee schedules, the lunch time will be deducted from your time worked between the scheduled start and end time. If the employees worked less than the lunch deduction, only the time worked will be deducted. And the lunch time will be deducted regardless if your employee clocked for it or not. If an employee clocks out for a break, he or she will lose the time they were clocked out for, as well as the lunch time if any has been specified. It is therefore important to decide whether you will make use of your lunch entry or not, as your employees have to either clock out for their unpaid breaks or not at all. Now, if we can have a look at our lunch schedule example, on the 1st of June, this employee clocked out at 12 and clocked back in for 12:30. The employee schedule already has an unpaid lunch of 30 minutes. The time clocked out for, as well as the lunch break, has been deducted from the total normal time. I'm just going to go back to our employee schedules again. Now, you can also see here your expected hours column. And the hours column is used for the allocation of your public holiday hours, your leave hours, daily balancing, and also to determine absenteeism. So if the value in the hours column for the day is greater than 0, the employee will be seen as absent if no clockings exist for the day. And if I can just show you a quick example again, we go to employees, you'll see here that Nathan was expected to clock in at 8, clock out at 5, but there are no clockings for the day and he is therefore seen as absent. Now at the bottom of your employee schedule, you have the options to override your global processing settings for this specific employer only. But let's go back to our global processor settings to have a look at the meaning of each of these. We're going to now look at the auto reset clocking direction. If the auto reset clocking direction is enabled and the employee did not clock out by the end of the day, his or her clocking direction and area will be set to out and outside. In other words, their next clocking will be an in clocking. Now let's examine the term end of the day a bit further once processing is enabled. The end of the day is determined as follows. If no schedule exists for the employee, the end of day is midnight. If a schedule exists, then the end of day is the midpoint of the start and the end times plus 12 hours. Now if I can show you this as an example, this schedule has a start time of 8 a.m. and the end time is 5 p.m. So the midpoint is 12:30. Now if we add 12 hours, the end of day is seen as 30 minutes past midnight. Now the auto reset direction function only changes the employee's clocking status at the end of the day. If no outclocking exists after an in-clocking, no hours will be calculated for that employee. And this is where the auto end day feature comes in. If the auto end day feature is enabled and the employee did not clock out by the end of the day, the clock will assume that the employee clocked out at his or her scheduled end time and then will calculate the employee's hours accordingly. Now please note, for this function to work, a schedule with a start and an end time must exist for the employee. And just to show you an example again, Nathan did clock in at 7:24 on the 14th, but there's no outclocking and is expected to work until 5 p.m. So what the clock did, it was to process his normal hours until 5 p.m. Next up is balancing. Overtime balancing can be enabled on your employee daily hours. So if it is enabled, your employee will not receive overtime until their expected hours have been filled. Now I'm going to show you an example again. So if we go back to our web interface, and just view for 1 week. On the 10th, you can see that the employee clocked in late, but worked past the expected end time. So and overtime balancing is enabled on this employee schedule. So the clock used the overtime to fill their normal time, and what is left over is still displayed under overtime. Now it is also possible to set up a schedule where your start and your end times has a period longer than your expected hours. In that case, if your employee exceeds the expected hours under normal, the overtime will be sent to the overtime column. As an example of that, let's go have a look at this employee. This employee has a schedule that starts at 6 in the morning and ends at 5 in the afternoon with a 1-hour lunch break. Almost every single day, the employee has worked more than 8 hours and the excess time has been sent to the overtime column. I'm going to skip the leave approved by default for now and move on to the rounding unit. Now if you want to round your clockings to the closest, let's say 5, 10 or 15 minutes, you need to enter the rounding unit in the global settings. During the processing of the hours, all your employee clockings will be rounded. Lunch clockings, in, outs, every single one. Rounding can be overridden on employee level as well. So if we just use an example quickly of an employee with an override, the global settings is set to 15 minutes on this clock. But for this specific employee, this employee's rounding has been overridden and it's been set to 1 minute. So as you can see there, it's not rounded at all, just to the closest minute. Now rounding is deemed to be half-half. So in other words, if we look at this picture, if your rounding period is set to 15 minutes. Then each clocking will be rounded to the closest quarter of an hour. So from the midpoint to the closest quarter of an hour. Let's go back to our global settings. And next up is our running totals. And this is mostly used for working flexi time. So if we go back and we have a look at our employee daily hours, you will see a column called variance. And the variance is the difference between the employee's expected hours and their worked hours. So if running totals are enabled, the variance for the day will be added to the running total of the previous day. If we can just make this a bit more simple, and we go to Ryan's screen here. So for the previous day, Ryan's total were already in the negative. He's got a positive value of 1 hour and 5 minutes which has been added, and his total for this day is now a negative 1 hour. And as he works the overtime, it will be shown in your variance column and it will be added to your running total. So at the end of this week he's got a positive value of 15 minutes in his running total. Please note, if you do any overrides on your daily hours or changes to an employee's clockings when running totals are enabled, it will trigger a reprocess of their daily hours from the date on which you're making the changes up to the current date. You can also override the running totals on employee level. In other words, you can just use it for some employees that's working flexi time, while the others it will be disabled on. So at this point we've had a look at all the options in the employee schedules and in the global settings. And you should now understand the basic processing rules and be able to set up your employee schedules. Now let's move on to the more advanced settings and the leave processing. Thresholds. If you want to set up a minimum number of hours that has been worked in a time category before any time is allocated, then you need to go and add a time category threshold. And to set a threshold, you need to go to the Advanced Global Settings, this link there, and the tab over here. As an example, say an employee must work at least 15 minutes of overtime before they will qualify for it. Or if they come in early and you do not want the hours reflected in your extra time column until they've been early for, let's say, at least an hour, then you need to set the values in here. Now, if you want to give overtime from 15 minutes onwards, you will need to set this overtime category to 14 minutes. If you set it to 15 minutes, it will only allocate overtime after 15 minutes. And the same for your extra time category. So 59 minutes if you want to see anything over an hour. Again, this is a global setting. So in other words, it will apply to all your employees, and this specifically, your time category thresholds, cannot be overridden on employee level. Okay, next I'm going to have a look at leave. Now, leave plays an important role to calculate your employee hours correctly. Let's go and have a look at our leave types. And by default, there are 5 leave types: the paid, sick, flexi, unpaid, and other. And I've added an extra one there at the bottom. Now, if you change or add a new leave type, you need to specify whether it's a paid leave type. In other words, is it going to assign the employee's expected hours or not? And should it affect your variance? If this is not ticked, then it will see your hours, your leave hours, as worked hours. If your leave type is paid, you can also select to which category your hours will be allocated to. When you add leave, you can add your leave record as a percentage of the employee's expected hours. You can also actually add more than 100%. So if you put in 200% there, the employee will receive their expected hours times 2. Now, things to remember around leave. Very important, leave records may not overlap at all. Another thing, if your leave record falls on a public holiday, public holiday hours are earned and not leave hours. This setting will determine whether the leave record is automatically marked as approved when added. So if I just go back to leave and go insert, because it's enabled, this little tick mark will be ticked when you insert a leave record. If that function is not enabled, the employee supervisor would need to come in, change the leave record, mark it as approved, and then they can also enter a comment under the approval tab. Now, to see the leave in action for an employee who's got a schedule, let's go to employee 8. This employee did clock off for the day and then went home sick. You can see the normal hours have been allocated as well as sick leave hours. Next up is our public holidays. Now, your public holiday dates must be entered in this window here, processing holidays. These public holidays are seen as paid holidays. So the employee will receive their expected hours in the holiday column regardless of whether they worked or not. And again, if I can show you an example, we had a holiday on the 16th of June, which was called Youth Day. You can see the employees with employee schedules and expected hours received their 8 hours for the day under holiday, or 6.5 hours. Employees that worked, which coincidentally these employees do not have employee schedules assigned to their name, it will still allocate their worked hours to the normal Saturday, Sunday, etc. category depending on the schedule for that day. You can also reassign time category hours. As an example, after your extra hours have been calculated, in other words, all the time worked before your expected start time, you can go and reassign those hours and add it to, for example, your normal time category or your overtime category. Again, this is something that's going to apply to all your employees, and it cannot be overridden on employee level. And to show you where to do that, this is under Global Settings, Advanced, General. Assign hours to the following time categories. So if you want to move your extra hours to normal or overtime, you select it from there. So anything worked before your expected start time will now be added to your overtime category. Of course, if you make changes after your hours have been processed, you will need to go and reprocess your hours from the date onwards. Now, in the next firmware release, we make provision for that. So if we go back to Global Settings, you'll see that there is something called Reprocess From Date. And you can set your date there to reprocess all the hours from the date that you specify onwards. Now, once you've set up the processing rules, you can go and rename your time categories and or your weekday names. And that is done under Processing, Global Translations. Now, please note, this is very important. Changing your time category names is not going to change the processing rules for those time categories. You may just want to change the descriptions to maybe match your payroll pay codes. So for example, you want to maybe change this to just OT 1.5 as an example. And maybe you just want to change your weekday names to just display the first 3 digits. So overtime is now changed to OT 1.5. So again, just to reiterate, changing the descriptions do not change the meaning of these categories. They will still do exactly the same thing even if you change the descriptions. We've gone through our settings for our daily hours calculations, and we get to the point where we want to see our payroll hours. I'm going to assume that my payroll is only 7 days long, and the payroll hours are actually just the sum of the daily hours for your selected period. You can also do payroll balancing on your payroll hours. So just again as an example, if we go to payroll hours, and as you can see, the from date and the to date is 1 day, and it gives you a total for your payroll hours for that specific day. Now if we change our date for this week, or for that week, this is our payroll hours for this period. Again, it's just a sum of the daily hours for each of these employees from this date to this date. Now the payroll balancing, you can see payroll balancing has been applied to some of our employees. This employee has been set to only work 32.5 hours per week. So anything in excess goes to overtime 1.5 there. This employee has been set to 40 hours, with the overtime has been moved to overtime 1.5. This employee does not have a payroll balancing entry assigned to his name. Now, the payroll balancing is set up under the Setup menu, Payroll Exports. And as you can see, I've already have 2 payroll exports in there. If you have different balancing rules for different groups of employees, for example 40 hours a week or 32.5 hours a week, you need to create a separate payroll export entry for each of those rules. And you can create these payroll extracts even if you do not export to a payroll, but you still want to apply your payroll balancing. So as an example, if we go and look at our 40 hours per week, you have an option to balance extra time, normal time, your overtime, and Saturday time. Now I'm not interested in balancing my extra time, so I'll move on to normal time. And my total for my payroll period, I want to set to 40 hours. And these 40 hours are made up of course, my normal time, and I've selected Saturday, Sunday, holiday, and my leave types. So if the total hours in these columns that I've selected are less than the total in my balance hours total, I need to fill that, and I want to fill it with hours in my overtime column. You can also select any of the others and it will fill it in order. So it will first move from the overtime column into normal, then maybe let's say you've selected Sunday time as sort of a double time, and then you want to move your Sunday time in there. If it's the other way around and these total hours exceeds the 40 hours, the excess hours will be sent to whatever category you select here. In my case, I've selected the overtime 1.5 column. Now once you've set up your payroll extracts, you need to assign these payroll exports or the balancing rules to your employees. And to do that, you go to your employees and you go change on them, and you'll see there is an entry called payroll type, and you can select the one that you wish to use from your drop down menu there. Once you've selected that and you view your payroll hours, it immediately applies those hours to your payroll total. If the CS time clock is not actually sufficient for your specific use, you do have an option to use other software. We've got TNA software available, more powerful processing features and additional other user features.